Guess what day it is?
Oh-ho!
It's French Friday, so grab your fries and say hooray! David French is here to play on French Friday. It's French Friday.
Hey everyone, it's Skye. Welcome back to another French Friday. Joining me, as always, is New York Times columnist and advocate of child bodily mutilation, David French. Hi, David.
Wait a minute. I'm not quite sure I'm agreeing with that biographical assessment.
Of course, I'm joking. That is the spin coming from your critics lately. So it feels like every time we record one of these, I'm coming in just on the tail end of another big controversy that you've got embroiled in, or at least pushback.
Gosh. Yeah. It's been an adventure the last few days. It's also an interesting test, kind of like the for those who want to go back to the old hits, the Blessings of Liberty conversation about like Drag Queen Story Hour. It's been an interesting test as to who is actually honest, engages with your argument, versus who is going to seize on either bad faith or ignorant distortions of your beliefs to try to further a narrative. And it will not surprise you, Skye, that the number of people screaming at me who actually were engaging with my position was really small.
Indeed. And we, of course, we're going to get into all of this and talk about what provoked it, your article, your column, the responses to it. But because you're starting there with the bad faith argumentation that tends to come at you, do you find it difficult not to engage in kind?
Oh,
sometimes the stuff is so ridiculous that's being said. How do you not wallow in the mud with them and just fling it right back?
Well, number one, if I wallow in the mud with them, then I'm a hypocrite, because I've been advocating for a long time that we've got to engage in good faith. We engage with the best expression of our opponent's points of views, that you don't return evil with evil. So that civility and decency are important values in a contentious democracy. So if I just sit there and answer bad faith distortion with a bad faith distortion that I send to my own Twitter followers, then what am I? I'm just them. And
fair enough. But okay,
that
our Lord
way lies madness and sin.
Our Lord does command us not to return evil for evil, but what about stupidity for stupidity?
No.
Is that allowed?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, it's actually a real challenge, Skye, because one of the problems, let's say somebody who has, 1.5 million Twitter followers or 500,000 or whatever, tweets something out that is a complete distortion or outright fabrication. You really have no good options, because if I engage, it's not like these people go, I'm sorry, right? They just double down and feed their audience further combativeness. And then if I do engage, then it actually is kind of their best day, because then they're in the fight that they wanted to have, right? So, but then at the same time, at some point, you just can't leave distortions out there. So I will do I'll use my own platform to try to correct misimpressions and mistakes and bad faith on Twitter. Every now and then I will choose a particular thread to respond to, like within the thread. I was actually just doing that in response to the owner of the Babylon Bee, and to another person or two whom I actually respect, who were saying, wait, has David changed his position? And so I thought it felt like a good faith ask, so I thought I'd respond to that. But one of the problems, Skye, we could actually dedicate a whole French Friday to how do you deal with bad faith online, including bad faith and just outright fabrications and misstatements in think pieces against you. Look, and I'm more able than the average person to deal with it, because I've got a decent sized following. I've got a pretty incredible platform at the New York Times. And so, nobody should feel sorry for me in the sense of an inability to respond. But still, there's the amount of just deception, The amount of misinformation out there just can feel overwhelming sometimes.
Well, we'll put a pin in that. Maybe we should come back to the broader conversation around how do we live online with unfair critics. But for anyone who's been listening for the last 5 minutes and doesn't know what we're talking about, they're definitely intrigued now. Yeah. What's been going on? So you wrote a column in the New York Times that was published on March 12th titled, "Don't Let the Culture War Degrade the Constitution."
Right.
We'll link to it in the show notes. Okay, when I started reading this, I thought to myself, not that you don't have original ideas, David, but I felt like I was at the beginning of this reading sort of David French's greatest hits. Like, yes, these are values that you have talked about repeatedly over the years that I've been reading you. The importance of fairness, of constitutional liberty, of protecting even those you disagree with. And okay, I got it. He's applying it to some more recent events, but I got it. And we'll get into some of that early part of the article later. But in the latter half of the article, you apply this to parental rights as it relates to a lot of the transgender issues that are filtering into public school systems and the law, and especially what's happening in Texas. So before we get into the people who are freaking out at you, can you unpack for us what's happening in Texas and your take on it?
Yeah, so it's really, let me broaden it out because I think it's misleading if we just sort of dive into Texas, because the thesis of the article, you're right, Skye, was absolutely sort of some of my basic discussion of civil liberties. And the reason why I wanted to bring it to the Times is, one, things keep happening. Like this issue just keeps metastasizing. And then the other reason is part of what you're doing when you're joining a new outlet with entirely a much bigger audience, many of whom have never read a syllable you've written, is one of the things you do is you try to introduce people to, here's where I'm coming from. This is sort of, so I thought this is a great opportunity to further introduce Times readers to where I'm coming from when it comes to civil liberties, and also to some recent issues that are quite disturbing. So the Times had just written, there's a news report in the Times that was quite controversial over the way in which many public schools withhold from parents information about their child transitioning at school.
Yeah, okay. I actually, in recent days, I've had conversations with people I know who are in public education, who are educators who are struggling with this very policy.
Right. So my point was that people are fighting, the point of the article is people are fighting the culture war intensely, and that intensity is becoming so great that the culture war is starting to deprive Americans of fundamental civil liberties. So if you don't like CRT, it's one thing to say, I don't like CRT and here are all the arguments against it. Fine, great. I agree with you on a lot of critiques about CRT. But don't ban the advocacy of the idea. That's when you are violating the First Amendment to fight the culture war. Well, one of the core civil liberties protected under American law and has been recognized by the Supreme Court for generations is parental rights over the education, the welfare, the well-being, the training, the upbringing of their children. Parents have extraordinary rights to control the upbringing and training and medical care of their kids. This is a sphere of parental authority that the law has really not allowed has not allowed too many state intrusions upon it. And so when I was talking, the trans issue, however, has become an area in which states have decided to start sort of expanding the notion, because I have a right to parent my children unless I am abusing them, right? Abuse or neglect. That's the phrase that's often used in the law, that my parental rights end where abuse begins, okay? And that's a proper limitation on parental authority. And
right.
So, right.
Okay, but before you go further, okay. It was helpful for me as I read your piece. You cite Chief Justice Warren Burger in the 1972 case Wisconsin v. Yoder, who said, quote, the primary role of the parents in the upbringing of their children is now established beyond debate as an enduring American tradition.
Yes.
So that was 50 years ago. but the limitation on the role of the parent, as you put it, is abuse. And what is it? Abuse and neglect? Is that the
abuse? Neglect is a form of abuse, but the main kind of limitation on the rights of a parent is.
So when that limitation where abuse is in place has now entered into the culture war lens,
right?
People on both sides of particularly the trans issue are arguing that on one side, to not affirm a child's desire to transition is equivalent to abuse. On the other side, to accommodate a child's desire to transition is abuse. And therefore, both sides are arguing this warrants the state intervening in the parental decisions that you may make for your child.
Right.
So you mentioned California in the article as one state that represents the more left end of the spectrum. And there's many others that fall into this. What's California doing that you would see as an infringement on parental rights?
Okay, so this is easy to explain. So what California has done is it enacted a statute that gives state courts very broad authority to permit children to come into the state to receive what they call gender-affirming health care, even if it's over the objection of a custodial parent, and even if a person is in the state seeking the treatment in violation of custodial orders from other states. So let me make this very concrete. Section 7 of the law of the relevant statute says that California courts normally, let me put it, needs to be a little bit of background, Skye. Normally, let's say I'm the non-custodial parent, and I don't like the custody arrangement that I have. I don't like the custody order of the court. I can't take my kid and go across state lines when I don't have custody. Let's say my weekend is over, and I'm saying instead of turning back my child to the custodial parent on Sunday at 5, I am heading across to California, and I'm going to try to get another crack at child custody in California courts. That's actually, in some circumstances, can be a form of kidnapping, okay? And so you take the child across the state lines. Normally, you are going to face consequences if you do that. Now, Section 7 of the California law states that courts won't weigh as a factor against you if you're seeking California court jurisdiction if you take the child from the person who has legal custody, if you're obtaining gender-affirming health care and that care is limited by the law or policy of another state. This is remarkable, Skye. So what this is saying is, if I am prohibited, if I'm a parent and the custodial parent is, say, in Texas, and under Texas rules that child cannot get gender-affirming care, I'm the non-custodial parent, I can go ahead and take the kid to California, even if I don't have legal custody. And then not only am I going to get a hearing in that court, it will not be used as a factor against me that I don't have custody and that I took the kid from the person who has legal custody. So you can see how this is an intrusion in parents' rights in much the same way that a public school withholding from parents information about gender transition is, in the absence of any evidence at all of parental abuse, that's an intrusion on parents' rights. And they're justified in those blue state examples often by the essential presumption that a parent might be abusive if they find out that their kid is transitioning, or in the California circumstance, that when you are fleeing a place, even if you don't have custody that won't grant, quote, gender-affirming health care, then you're going to be treated the same as if you're fleeing a place where there was abuse. That's a big expansion of that notion, and that's a blue state issue that I just outlined very clearly in my piece. And when I wrote the piece, I thought, you know what? I'm going to get a ton of blowback from very progressive readers who are upset at how I've highlighted these blue state practices. And yeah, in the Times comment section, that was absolutely the case.
So, okay, before we move on, transition to the red state issue, I want to dig a little deeper into this, the blue state dynamic that California represents. Are you aware of any other area of caregiving, medical care, psychiatric care, where a non-custodial parent has a right to remove a child across state lines to seek that care without the consent of the custodial parent? Or is it limited to gender identity?
Now, there are abilities to move a child across state lines to flee abuse.
Sure.
Okay, so, but outside of that, I'm not aware. So the problem is then the equating the creation of a statutory framework where you can be fleeing abuse or fleeing to receive, quote, gender-affirming care, and the two are treated the same way.
Because to not get that gender-affirming care is seen as abuse.
Correct.
Okay. Well, there's a number of remarkable things there. Obviously, number one, that the state is intervening to essentially nullify the custodial parent's role.
Right.
In this. And then secondly, that the reason for nullifying the custodial parent's role is because of gender-affirming care, which exalts that issue as somehow more important than the hundreds of other things that we might go across state lines to get for our children, which it's just, the whole thing is mind-blowing. And again, before we move on to the other side of this whole equation, I've had conversations recently directly with or about educators who are struggling because they're in public school districts that have a policy similar to what you're describing, where, as one educator told me, they are fine with addressing a child by whatever gender pronoun or name they want to, out of a sense of hospitality, of Christian charity, whatever it might be. But this educator was saying that they struggle immensely with the idea that they cannot talk to the parent about this. And especially at a younger age where parents and teachers cooperate all the time on the care of those children and their education and their behavior and all these other dynamics that often create communication between teachers and parents. But in this one area, they're not allowed to talk about it. And the teacher expressed it as like feeling as if they are betraying the trust of the parent and they're not legally allowed to. Again, is there any parallel? Is there any other example in the law where that is established, where a teacher is not allowed to talk to a parent?
Off the top of my head, there might be circumstances in some, again, in blue jurisdictions where you might be dealing with something like abortion, other issues that there might be specific carve-outs. Again, I don't know the law of all 50 states, but as a general matter, to say that you may not talk to a parent, again, you read that quote from Wisconsin v. Yoder, very, very, very important case. You may not talk to a parent about something as significant in a child's life as gender transition is an unbelievable intrusion on parents' rights. And to be clear, I am not saying that in a circumstance where there is evidence that, for example, a child has been actually abused, that sometimes, regardless of the issue, right, then an educator, if a child has actually been abused, then an educator is a mandatory reporter.
That's right.
Okay, so they report, okay? So then you start to unfold a legal process there. But then the other thing is, whatever the issue, if a child says, I'm abused, I was physically beaten because I played Dungeons and Dragons, just to come up with something. Number one, you report the physical abuse. And then number two, in that circumstance, if you see the child playing Dungeons and Dragons at school, you might not want to tell the parent if you have evidence that they get physically abused, right? So that's a different deal from saying, okay, I'm ordinarily going to talk to parents about everything from, have I seen Johnny crying a lot at school? Or, there's something about their homework that seems off. You have these conversations, and I'm going to have them about everything except, quote unquote, gender affirming or transition type communications. What that does to parental rights is take a situation where I have authority over my child, I have the control over my child unless I actually abuse, and then turns it into a virtual presumption of abuse.
That's right.
if a child is transitioning. And that's just not the way parental rights work at all.
So, one of the things I can't quite get my head around, and maybe I'm just not exposed enough to this. On the one hand, the rhetoric I'm hearing from the very pro-trans voices that are out there is a desire to normalize this whole dynamic. It's normal for people to rethink their gender identity. It's normal for kids to explore these ideas. They want to destigmatize it and just make it normative. But on the other hand, what we're hearing is this is so special and so unique and so important that we are going to treat it unlike any other part of childhood, to the point where we're not even going to allow educators to talk to parents about it because it's that sacred and important and and limited to that individual's own discovery.
Right.
How can you have it both ways? It's normative, and yet it's the most special thing in the world that we're going to create entirely new laws to protect it.
Yeah, it doesn't really make any sense. And that goes exactly to the point I was making in my piece, which is that there are policies that states can enact that advance state values, for example. But every state policy is going to have to stop when it runs into the brick wall of some very basic civil liberties, like free speech, like religious freedom, like parents' rights. And that if the culture war is saying, our point of view is so righteous that to advance it, we have to bulldoze the First Amendment. We have to bulldoze parental authority. Watch out. We should watch out.
Okay, so let's flip over now from the blue state dynamic to the red state dynamic, of which Texas is the exemplar. Explain what's going on there and why you believe it is a violation of these civil rights or civil liberties, and then we'll get into the pushback that you received on that end.
Yes. Okay. So Texas, the Texas Attorney General put together a Texas Attorney General's opinion that essentially said that surgical and pharmaceutical intervention for childhood gender transition was child abuse. So this wasn't an act of the Texas state legislature. This was an Attorney General's opinion under that he construed Texas law in that direction. And then Governor Abbott wrote a letter directing essentially Texas Child Protective Services to investigate families whose children have received medical or pharmaceutical intervention to facilitate gender transition. Now, it is absolutely, Skye, within the authority of the state to ban life-altering medical treatments for kids. Okay, or to sharply limit. To give you an example, California, which has this extremely welcoming attitude towards quote-unquote gender-affirming care for minors, very sharply limits at what age you can get a tattoo. Okay, so it is absolutely within the sphere of the state to limit access to certain kinds of life-altering elective medical procedures for kids.
So the Texas state legislature could propose a bill saying that these procedures or medical treatments that would cause lasting or permanent change to a person's gender are prohibited in the state of Texas. Correct. Under the age of 16, 18, whatever they want it to be. And they could pass that bill and it would be law, and there's nothing unconstitutional about that.
Correct. Now,
but that's not what's happened.
It's not what's happened as of the time of this letter, for sure. Essentially what they're saying is, then, okay, let's suppose that I am a parent of a kid. And now let's remember, Skye, that you're going to find a ton of doctors and medical professionals who will tell you, if you're a parent, that facilitating gender transition not only is the best course of action for your child, it might very well be life-saving for your child. That's the information that parents are going to get. So that you're not talking about parents who have any sort of malicious intent for their children at all. You're talking about parents who are confronting a challenge they never anticipated, who are seeking out the advice of doctors, the advice of psychologists, you name it, And they're going to get from an awful lot of voices the idea and the message that if you don't facilitate this gender transition, you are very much harming your child. Okay.
Okay. And if I can add into that a little bit from my limited experience here, I've brought it up numerous times on the show before. When I was a seminary student, I spent a semester as a hospital chaplain. Mm-hmm. And one of the things, and this would have been probably 2000, roughly, I encountered, at one point I was there overnight, there was a child born in labor and delivery whose gender was ambiguous. It is a rare condition, but it does happen where an abnormality occurs in the gestation of the child and they're born and it's not clear if this is a boy or a girl. In that case, genetic testing is done, all kinds of things. But there is a small percentage of people, when you get beyond the politics and the culture warring about transgenderism, there has always been a small percentage of people for whom gender identity is a significant challenge, both psychologically and anatomically, right, that has required medical intervention. And it puts parents in a really challenging place to get the best medical advice they can from doctors, psychiatrists, physicians, and they need to make decisions in the best care of their child. So it feels as if what's coming out of Texas is essentially the criminalization of those parents.
Well, yes, to a large degree. And to be really clear, Skye, then what Texas is essentially saying is if I, as a loving parent who has no intent to abuse my child at all, and in fact is trying to prevent psychological harm to my child, go to a place, even whether it's in Texas or elsewhere, where that quote gender affirming care, I don't like that phrase, but that's the phrase that's always used in the law. They go to a state or a location where that is available, lawful, and recommended, that Texas authorities could conceivably take their child from them. Now, the issue there you have, number one, is, okay, if you're going to enact that as a standard, what you're having to do is essentially say, okay, we're going to change the definition and expand the definition of abuse.
Right.
Because under classic definitions of abuse, you're not going to find a doctor in America who's going to say hitting a kid with a bat is a healthy parenting practice, or the classic,
sure,
or taking food away from your child for a week, whatever it is. Classic abuse and neglect is criminal behavior. Okay, so in this circumstance, what you're doing is you're saying, okay, legal medical interventions undertaken in good faith are now abusive under state law, sufficient to perhaps fracture the family. And see, my issue there was, look, I believe in placing strict limits on the ability of healthcare providers in a state to engage in surgical or pharmaceutical interventions with children that are life-altering. 100% in favor of strict limitations, including preferably outright bans, okay? But at the same time, if we create a world in which we're going to call parents abusive if they are in good faith seeking out recommended and legal medical procedures that we can then separate child from parents, we have open Pandora's box on parental rights, and we're inflicting a profound separate injury on that family. Stripping a parent and a child, separating a parent and a child is something that can, even when there's abuse, Skye, has traumatic impact on children and parents, even when it's justified. Now, you add in when there is no malice, where parent and child are completely unified that what they're doing is loving and they're in a complete agreement on it, and then the state comes in and rips them to pieces. My gosh, the injury that is inflicted there. That's an entire separate injury, and it's a expansion of the ability of the state to peer into parental decision making. And that's where I I have real problems.
Okay, so we're going to get into some quotes from a critic who responded to your piece that I'll let you address in a minute. But before we do that, I want to make sure I'm understanding what sounds to me like hypocrisy on the part of Texas in this. Because on the one hand, Texas has not banned these procedures. But on the other hand, they're saying to parents, if you, with the advice of doctors and with the consent of your child and with the intent to care and love them, if you engage in any of these practices, we're going to take your child from you because it's abuse. How can you have it both ways?
Yeah,
shouldn't they just flat out ban these practices through the legislature, through the law, if they believe it's that universally horrible?
And there is a bill pending. So there was a bill introduced this year that would ban that kind of care in Texas. So there is a bill pending. But what Texas did essentially was say, and if I'm a representative of Texas defending the governor's office, and say, wait a minute, we were just operating under the Attorney General's legal opinion that Texas law already bans this. An Attorney General's legal opinion is not a statute. Let's just put that out there. And then the other thing that's in factor here, Skye, is that the Texas Attorney General's opinion is a really interesting, in many ways, attempt to extend the authority of Texas beyond its borders. Right. So let's suppose the leading clinic is in Minnesota. Again, I'm just making this, I don't know where the leading clinic is. Mm-hmm. But let's say it's in Minnesota and I go get consultations in Minnesota and I live in Texas and I do things in Minnesota that are completely legal in Minnesota. Then I come home, can Texas take my kid, right? That's where this gets really rough. And again, one of the things we have to understand and we have to think through when we're talking about civil liberties, it is not an argument against a civil liberty that somebody else would make a choice with their freedom that you disagree with. The existence of civil liberties is a fundamental basic backstop that says there are certain rights that are so important and so precious that we're going to protect them from majority rule.
Right.
And so that's where my issue is. Are we going to go into that important, precious parental right, expand the circumstances under which the state can intervene, and then think that once you've expanded it, well, then that's only going to work for righteousness, justice, and truth? The fact of the matter is, no. You know who would absolutely take advantage of expanded ability to look at the parent-child relationship? Oh, about every state.
Right. So going back to the earlier comments you made about the clarity of what counts as abuse, not feeding a child for a week, beating him with a baseball bat. I mean, if Texas passed a law that says you cannot burn cigarettes into the skin of your child, but Oklahoma says that's totally fine, that would be bizarre because but this is a case where gender-affirming care, I'm using air quotes, the language that seems to be commonplace now, there's ambiguity across different states and communities about whether or not that is abuse. It's not as clear-cut as these other things, but the critics, especially the one I'm going to read here in a minute, their core argument is essentially, no, there's no ambiguity here. This is abuse, and therefore the state should regulate it. So I came across this article, I don't know if you saw it, it was in the Washington Examiner by Kaylee McGhee White. And it's titled, "Yes, the state has both the right and the responsibility to restrict gender ideology." Direct response to your piece.
To restrict gender ideology?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the title's not great.
Okay.
Let me quote part of what she says. She says, French points out that giving the state additional authority over familial relationships is a slippery slope, arguing that this authority could easily be used against, say, homeschooling families if the other side of the political aisle comes into power and decides to use it to their own advantage. This is true, But the fact is, there are no laws on the books in any state banning homeschooling, while there are many laws criminalizing various forms of child abuse. Because government officials and voters are very capable of making distinctions between things that are morally reprehensible and things that are non-preferable. And in this case, there is no question at all that surgically and chemically mutilating children who are too young to understand the long-term ramifications of their decisions is morally reprehensible. This reality must take priority over any concern of a slippery slope, no matter how legitimate it may be. Okay, so my summary of that is it's completely clear to her that gender-affirming care is abusive, and therefore the state should intervene and prevent this in all cases. And she's not worried about the state using its newfound power to intervene between parent and child to go against what they may want in the future, because at the end, we're right. That's what it comes down to.
Right. Okay. It is. Oh gosh. Okay. Where to begin? First, let's remember she used the homeschooling example. Mm-hmm. Okay. The widespread legality of homeschooling is the result of a long legal fight. Okay. The states all across this country had for a long time pretty darn dramatically restricted homeschooling. They had tried to essentially force parents to hand their kids over to either state-run institutions or private institutions that were going to educate their children. There was the development of homeschooling in the United States was a long legal slog that depended on what? Parents' rights to go ahead and win it. And in fact, if you go back and you look at the parents' rights cases at the Supreme Court of the United States, time and again, what are they, Skye? Education cases. They're cases where the state tried to restrict parental authority over education. So what you're looking at, when you're looking at the educational freedom that the author there is celebrating, what she's looking at is the result of a coming up on 100-year long, if not longer, battle to secure parents' rights in the educational context. So the parents' rights doctrine that exists today is the result of mainly conservative and religious families fighting for greater recognition of the inherent constitutional inherent constitutional right to parent your children. So that's an example in my favor, I would say. The second thing that I would say is, look, one of the problems that we have here is that Skye, with every single bit of confidence with which she has stated that granting parents, or that she has stated that doing that gender transition medical interventions are abusive, the same amount of confidence that she states that they're abusive, there is a whole other part of the United States of America that's politically dominant in large chunks of the country that says it's abusive not to do it.
Right.
Okay. And so then the question becomes, what if parents are sitting here and you're going to have red parents in blue jurisdictions and blue parents in red jurisdictions? What I submit is they should have the same rights to direct the care and to govern the care of their children. And that the state, if it wants to regulate medical procedures, which I think it should not permit permanent life-altering medical interventions on children. Regulate the procedure.
Okay, let me read one more paragraph from her piece, which I find the most chilling and terrifying. Here's what she says. Even if Texas's order is someday used against the right, that does not change the fact that the government has a responsibility to uphold what is good and punish what is evil right here and right now. We cannot sit around and twiddle our thumbs out of fear that what we do might come back to bite us when we have both the power and the responsibility to govern well. To do so would be to abandon the entire point of government. The only question that matters, this is the kicker, the only question that matters at this point is whether Texas's order advances what is really good.
I mean, Skye, that argument would justify overriding every single constitutional right.
Exactly. So here's what came to my mind. Why, based on that logic, that the government simply exists to uphold good and punish evil, and anything the government does to uphold good is justified, why doesn't the government prosecute people for blasphemy?
Oh, a lot of these folks want that.
Why not prosecute and jail people for adultery?
A lot of these folks want that. I mean, there's part of the new right that is, I had this really memorable episode. There was this, do you remember there used to be a social media, and it might still exist, it's just not talked about very much anymore, called a social media platform called Clubhouse.
Vaguely, yeah.
It's like Twitter Spaces. It's where you join, it's sort of like you can listen on other people's conference calls.
That's right.
So there was a Clubhouse room called David French Based or Cringe that I found out about as being in process. This was like 2 or 3 years ago. And I'm sitting there at dinner, and my wife said, and somebody DM'd me and said, there's a David French Based or Cringe Clubhouse room going. And I was like, oh, that's hilarious. And then Nancy said, you should join it. And I thought, that's a good idea. So I clicked the link and I join it, and that means you listen, you hear the conversation going in process. And I hear somebody just brutally insulting me, just absolutely lacerate, because it turns out that there was actually no question in these people's minds. Their answer was cringe. So it was sort of a David French gripe session, which is weird. But then as soon as I hop in, the organizer says, David's here. Like, what? No, David's actually here. And so they promoted me to panelist so that I could speak. And I said to them, look, I read a lot of what's written about me online, and a lot of it's just straw man. It's all straw man stuff. So here's the real person. Ask me whatever you want to ask me. And what followed was a fascinating, sometimes contentious 3-hour conversation that near the end concluded with a Harvard law student yelling at me that the original intent, raising his voice angry at me, that the original intent of the Constitution allows for anti-blasphemy laws. So there's absolutely part of the right that would be happy with anti-blasphemy laws, absolutely a part of the right that would be happy with a dramatic diminishment of the First Amendment. This is part of the Christian nationalist argument.
But this is what's so bizarre to me. We've talked many times on French Friday about the loss of classical liberalism, of freedom of conscience, the Bill of Rights, and it's being pushed by both the extreme left and the extreme right. But this argument that the government exists to advance whatever is good assumes, number one, that we have some absolute clarity on what that good is, and that the full power of the government ought to be used in force. This is exactly what Roger Williams and others tried to get away from by leaving England and coming to the New World. This is exactly what the founders tried to avoid when they put the First Amendment in place and established no religion and gave freedom of speech and press and assembly. And we're so quick to throw those things away because we assume that the government was going to do what I want it to do, and is not going to be taken up by my political adversaries to do what they want to do. It's so short-sighted and naive, it's hard for me to believe that intelligent people who can put a sentence together would believe it.
Or even worse, that smart people who know that their opponents may use this power against them don't care. And the fact of the matter is, Skye, they really do care, but they're just trying to win an internet argument.
Ugh. This sounds like Taliban kind of stuff.
Oh, it's the extremism of it. And the anti-constitutionalism of it is stunning. And then what ends up happening is that you then begin to have this sort of whole online nonsense where one set of people will say, David is totally fine with gender transition for minors.
Right.
No, I actually favor laws prohibiting medical and pharmaceutical interventions. David is a tool of the woke left. No, I actually think that Gavin Newsom's law is unconstitutional, intervention against parental rights, and blue jurisdictions that are withholding transitioning information from parents are violating the Constitution as well. And really it boils down to the argument that you're only really, truly against this negative thing A, B, C, or D, if you're willing to and sometimes eager to diminish American civil liberties to accomplish your mission.
Right.
And that's where I draw the line.
So I feel like I've had this conversation a number of times in recent days where the refusal to agree with the most extreme point of view on one side means that you get accused of agreeing with the extreme position on the other side. And
right.
it echoes back to 2016, which I'm sure brings back wonderful memories for you, when those of us who did not support Donald Trump were accused of fully supporting Hillary Clinton. And it's like, no, just because I don't support Trump does not mean I'm endorsing
right.
everything that Hillary Clinton is advocating. And there was no willingness to acknowledge that there's anything in between those two possibilities. Similarly, to say you don't support the posture taken by Texas does not mean you're fully endorsing the posture taken by California. What happened to common sense? What happened to the spectrum of views in the political public square where now everything is just a polarity?
It exists. Common sense exists, just typically not as much on Twitter. Although there was this really funny kind of back and forth that I saw where somebody had tagged me once again in this claiming that I was woke, that I was in favor of, quote, mutilating children and all of this utter nonsense. And so right under it, somebody says, I don't know what's going on. I Googled David French and transgender, and I saw that a bunch of left-wing groups had condemned him and that he'd signed the Nashville Statement. And it was like, when you get off Twitter and you actually get a fuller picture, the weird thing is, Skye, for weeks I was facing very vigorous protest from the left over the fact that I'd been hired by the Times. Why? Because of my position on transgender issues. And then the hard right comes after me saying I'm incredibly woke. Why? Because of my position on transgender issues. It's the wildest thing.
So let's take this down to kind of the local level a little bit. In the town I'm living in, there's like this big battle happening right now over the school board. And to put my cards on the table a little bit, my kids have been in public schools. I'm a public school product of the same community. I believe strongly in public schools. There are certain things going on in our public school system right now that I am not thrilled about, that are bothering me a little bit. But there is this slate of candidates who are presenting themselves to our community who are also not happy with where the public school system is right now, but they're proposing an extreme alternative on the far right. And the attitude in some of the community now is, well, if you're not supporting them, then you're supporting the status quo. Right. And you're okay with where things are. So even forget our national politics, our local politics, it's behaving this way as well. And when it comes especially to this transgender question and educators who aren't allowed to talk to parents about it, and we've seen some of the statistics that have been coming out from the CDC about depression, anxiety, and some of the gender nonconforming dynamics that are happening with young people today, and the explosion of this dynamic in particularly blue parts of the country. Like, there's a lot happening in this realm, and parental rights is part of it. How do we not make the battleground the kids? And sacrifice their well-being in all this? How do we keep it in the legislatures, in the school boards, in the places where adults can make decisions? Because it feels like we're recruiting our young people into this, and they're going to be the ones who suffer as a result.
Well, so first, really, it's because of the kids is one of the reasons why everything is so intense. Right. For the children, like The Simpsons lampooned that years and years ago. But if you can say anything and then you add for the children, you've just ratcheted up the intensity several degrees. So because it's intense in many ways, because it's dealing with children. And then the other thing, what we have to recognize is what we're dealing with, Skye, is a very cynical bullying tactic, and you have to resist it. And the very cynical bullying tactic is exactly what you said. Either you're for me, or either you're for what I'm doing to the extent that I'm doing it and the way that I'm doing it, or you're all the way on the other side.
Right.
And so you get this all the time in politics. So you'll have a Republican primary, just to take an example that I'm most familiar with, where they nominate a corrupt, radical, lying extremist, and then say to you, yeah, yeah, any number of people. So you nominate a corrupt, radical extremist, and then if somebody says, I'm not really wanting to talk about, or I don't really want to have somebody who's just fundamentally dishonest and corrupt representing me in Congress. And then they'll say, oh, so you're in favor of killing babies. You're like, yeah. Wait, can I not be against abortion and also for honest and decent politicians? Can I not have both of those values? So that I got this all the time. If I was against Roy Moore, where there was an incredibly strong evidence that he had abused girls, then I'm for killing babies by not voting for an abuser, somebody for whom there is a considerable evidence he'd abused kids, okay? It's a bullying tactic. And then the bottom line is, it's such a bullying tactic that even if you're, in some places, even if you're a Republican that's with them on 80%, if you're not with them on 100%, they'll make your life a living hell. I'll give you a good example. My brother-in-law is a rock-ribbed Republican. So far as I know, two-time Trump voter, became a member of the school board here locally, was wrestling with issues like should certain books be on the shelves of the library, and very open to parental critiques about books and, all of this stuff. But he had to have security with him. Why? Because he works for Pfizer. So...
and they make a vaccine.
It was so weird and extreme that the person who was with them on 90% of stuff, again, he didn't go all the way to some of the truly radical, like book banning and all of this stuff, but who was with them on 90%, he had to have security because he worked for Pfizer. And that's some of the dynamic that we're dealing with here, is just an extraordinary amount of extremism and an extraordinary amount of ferocity. And the bullying and the manipulation is, if you're not with the extremism and the ferocity, they will call you woke. They will say you're for all kinds of terrible things. It's a form of bullying and manipulation, and we shouldn't consent to it.
So there's been a lot written about this, but it feels like there's an inversion that's happened. We've always had extremes in America. We've always had the fringe on the far right or the far left. And yet our structures, our media, our politics, our parties were designed in order to not give too much platform and power to those extremes. And they moderated it by ensuring that the representatives more in the middle were the ones who ascended into authority and power. But because of various things, the primary system, social media, cable news, we've inverted that now. And it feels like the majority of us who are somewhere in the middle on a lot of this stuff are being eclipsed by the crazies on the two extremes. And is it a structural issue that can be repaired, or is this just the trajectory we're on and there's no going back?
I do think there is a structural problem that can be addressed, if not necessarily completely fixed. And one of the things, Skye, that's interesting is, by no normal measure would I be called in the middle on this. Okay. So, but on the gender issue.
Yes, but you are in the majority, I would argue, and in the middle when it comes to civil liberties for all sides.
Oh, I would say I'm in a small minority on that point. I think that's it's a diminishing number of people who are for civil liberties for everybody. But we digress. The main point you're raising, I think, is the really important thing, and that is, what can we do about a dynamic where a small number of people have disproportionate influence?
Right.
One thing that we can do, a very simple thing, is stop having first past the post primaries where somebody can win with 35% of the vote. So, one of the things that happens in many jurisdictions is you'll have somebody who an extremist who wins a primary with a minority of the vote and then goes on and presents the larger electorate with, it's either this guy or the Democrat, binary choice, binary choice, binary choice. And so one of the things we can do is stop having, and the Republican Party in its presidential nominations is particularly prone to this because unlike the Democrats who do proportionate representation, if you win 51% of a primary, you get 51% of the delegates. If you win 33% of the primary, you get 33% of the delegates. And the Republican primary, in most of these primaries, if you win 33% and your next closest competitor wins 32%, you get 100% of the delegates. That's how Trump was able to clinch so quickly in 2016.
Is there any movement in the Republican Party to reform that?
There has been discussion. I just haven't seen it come to fruition in any real way. And then the other thing, Skye, is quite frankly, we need more people to participate in primaries. So, one of the problems is that only the most motivated Americans tend to vote in the primary election. And that cohort is disproportionately extreme. Not everyone who votes in primaries, I vote in primaries, but not everyone who votes in primaries is extreme, but it's a disproportionate extremist representation in primaries. So part of this is a lot of our passivity is creating our own problem. And you see this all the time when people say, man, I can't believe the candidates that they served up to us. I'm like, well, who's the they? You could have voted.
I don't recall if we've talked about this in the past, but do you feel ranked choice voting is part of the solution here?
Yes, I'm a big believer in trying it. I'm a big believer of trying it. So, I'm not going to say that it's the solution, but I do very much like anything that gets us out of that binary choice mindset. And, one that says, hey, here's 5 people, rank your top 5. Easy to do and can really help us. And one of the good things about ranked choice voting is that you cannot win a ranked choice contest without at least 50% plus one people listing you as one of their preferential candidates.
Yeah, so it's kind of, I don't want to get into the weeds of explaining to people how ranked choice voting works. If they're not familiar with it, there's some really helpful YouTube videos and little animations that will explain it.
Yeah.
A number of European countries use this model. It's also being experimented with, I believe, in Alaska and Maine. Is that correct?
Yes, Maine, Alaska. I think also like the Democratic primary in New York City. Now, one of the problems you've had is those are 3 very unusual jurisdictions.
Right.
Alaska and Maine are super rural. It often means that your returns are quite delayed. And then the New York voting system is just a mess for reasons unrelated to ranked choice voting. So unfortunately, a lot of people have experienced ranked choice voting as long delayed results.
Right.
When the reality is there's nothing inherent to ranked choice voting that should extend it very much at all, because especially with electronic voting, you're rerunning each round. You can rerun each round quite quickly. But the problems with Alaska and Maine and New York, a lot of times it just takes a long time to get the ballots to even begin to count them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go into a whole nother excursion into ranked choice voting, except that the more I've studied it, the more intriguing it is. One of the problems, and I think it would go a long way in solving some of the extremism that we're seeing in our states and then in our federal government. Part of the problem, though, is if you are going to try to roll out this relatively new, unfamiliar form of voting in a country where a significant segment of the population, 30, 40%, already believes the election system is rigged and doesn't trust it, and you're going to complicate it even more, it seems like just too high a hill to climb. But man, I really feel like something like that's needed.
It's one of these downline consequences of dishonesty. When you've had people who have been working overtime to dishonestly cast doubt on election results and to dishonestly generate mistrust in vote counting, there's all kinds of downline consequences of that. And one of them is that even promising reforms like ranked choice voting get filtered through this atmosphere of intentionally and maliciously created mistrust, and it creates a real barrier to positive change.
Well, and that brings us full circle to what we began with and all the bad faith arguments that fill our media, social media and otherwise, which ends up distorting really good, clear thinking like the sort you display in your column that I think a lot of people on all sides would benefit from reading and understanding, but it gets misrepresented. And then next thing you know, you're in a chat room with a bunch of people screaming at you because clearly you're a shill for the left. But here we are. David, thank you for your wisdom on this. I'm sure a lot of people listening are facing these conversations in their own communities and school districts, and teachers are facing this, and medical professionals. This is just something that permeates every level of our culture, and unfortunately has been taken up into the culture war rather than into thoughtful conversation where it belongs.
Well, and one thing to also note to some listeners, I guarantee there are some listeners who've heard me walk through all of this and go, that's really complicated. Yeah. And the answer is yes, it is.
Right.
It is complicated. And then people will attack you for dealing with complicated things with the sort of nuance that complicated things deserve. Not everything can be super simple. It's just, there's just no way around that, especially in a super diverse, pluralistic country with a backdrop of fundamental civil liberties that backstop all actions of the government, or that can stand as a roadblock in front of actions of the government, even actions you strongly agree with. It's complicated. It is complicated, and we don't do anyone any favors if we pretend that there are simple answers.
Yeah, we've joked over the years that one of the subtitles we could tag onto the Holy Post is, everything you think is actually more complicated than you realize.
Right.
It really is.
Exactly.
All right, David. Well, until next time, thank you for being with us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I always enjoy it.
French Friday is a production of Holy Post Media, featuring David French and me, Skye Jethani. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This show is made possible by Holy Post patrons. To find out how you can become a Holy Post patron and to find more common good Christian content, go to holypost.com.